This reading contains excerpts from the Psychopathology of Everyday Life by Sigmund Freud, 1901, which is in the public domain. The full text is available freely via Project Gutenberg at https://www.gutenberg.org/ebook/56550. Chapter 1, Forgetting of Proper Names. During the year 1898 I published a short essay on the psychic mechanism of forgetfulness. I shall now repeat its contents and take it as a starting point for further discussion. I have there undertaken a psychologic analysis of a common case of temporary forgetfulness of proper names, and from a pregnant example of my own observation I have reached the conclusion that this frequent and practically unimportant occurrence of a failure of a psychic function of memory admits an explanation which goes beyond the customary utilization of this phenomenon. If an average psychologist should be asked to explain how it happens that we often fail to recall a name which we are sure we know, he would probably content himself with the answer that proper names are more apt to be forgotten than any other content of memory. He might give plausible reasons for this, forgetting preference for proper names, but he would not assume any deep determinant for the process. I was led to examine exhaustively the phenomenon of temporary forgetfulness through the observation of certain peculiarities, which, although not general, can, nevertheless, be seen clearly in some cases. In these there is not only forgetfulness, but also false recollection. He who strives for the escaped name brings to consciousness other substitutive names which, although immediately recognized as false, nevertheless obtrude themselves with great tenacity. The process which should lead to the reproduction of the lost name is, as it were, displaced, and thus brings one to an incorrect substitute. Now it is my assumption that the displacement is not left to psychic arbitrariness, but that it follows lawful and rational paths. In other words, I assume that the substitutive name or names stands in direct relation to the lost name, and I hope, if I succeed in demonstrating this connection, to throw light on the origin of the forgetting of names. In the example which I selected for analysis in 1898, I vainly strove to recall the name of the master who made the imposing frescoes of the Last Judgment in the Dome of Orvieto. Instead of the lost name Signorelli, two other names of artists, Botticelli and Boltraffio, obtruded themselves, names which my judgment immediately and definitely rejected as being incorrect. When the correct name was imparted to me by an outsider, I recognized it at once without any hesitation. The examination of the influence and association paths which caused the displacement from Signorelli to Botticelli and Boltraffio led to the following results. A. The reason for the escape of the name Signorelli is neither to be sought in the strangeness in itself of this name nor in the psychologic character of the connection in which it was inserted. The forgotten name was just as familiar to me as one of the substitutive names, Botticelli, and somewhat more familiar than the other substitute, Boltraffio, of the possessor of which I could hardly say more than that he belonged to the Milanese school. The connection, too, in which the forgetting of the name took place appeared to me harmless, and led to no further explanation. I journeyed by carriage with stranger from Ragusa, Dalmatia, to station in Herzegovina. I refrained from imparting this characteristic feature because I did not wish to touch upon such a delicate theme in conversation with a stranger, but I went still further. I also deflected my attention from the continuation of the thought which might have associated itself in me with the theme, death and sexuality. I was at that time under the after effects of a message which I had received few weeks before, during brief sojourn in Trafway. A patient on whom I had spent much effort had ended his life on account of an incurable sexual disturbance. I know positively that this sad event, and everything connected with it, did not come to my conscious recollection on that trip in Herzegovina. However, the agreement between Trafway and Boltraffio forces me to assume that this reminiscence was at that time brought to activity despite all the intentional deviation of my attention. D. I can no longer conceive the forgetting of the name Signorelli as an accidental occurrence. I must recognize in this process the influence of motive. There were motives which actuated the interruption in the communication of my thoughts concerning the customs of the Turks, etc., and which later influenced me to exclude from my consciousness the thought connected with them, and which might have led to the message concerning the incident in Trafway. That is, I wanted to forget something. I repressed something. To be sure, I wished to forget something other than the name of Master of Orvieto, but this other thought brought about an associative connection between itself and this name, so that my act of volition missed the aim, and I forgot the one against my will, while I intentionally wished to forget the other. The disinclination to recall directed itself against the one content, the inability to remember appeared in another. The case would have been obviously simpler if this disinclination and the inability to remember had concerned the same content. The substitutive names no longer seem so thoroughly justified as they were before this explanation. They remind me, after the form of a compromise, as much of what I wish to forget as of what I wish to remember, and show me that my object to forget something was neither a perfect success nor a failure. The nature of the association formed between the lost name and the repressed theme, death and sexuality, etc., containing the names of Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Trafoi, is also very strange. In the scheme inserted here, which originally appeared in 1898, an attempt is made to graphically represent these associations. The name Signorelli was thus divided into two parts. One pair of syllables, Ellie, returned unchanged in one of the substitutions, while the other had gained, through the translation of Signor Sir Herr, many and diverse relations to the name contained in the repressed theme, but was lost through it in the reproduction. Its substitution was formed in a way to suggest that a displacement took place along the same associations, Herzegovina and Bosnia, regardless of the sense and acoustic demarcation. The names were therefore treated in this process like the written pictures of sentence which is to be transformed into picture puzzle reviews. No information was given to consciousness concerning the whole process, which, instead of the name Signorelli, was thus changed to the substitutive names. At first sight, no relation is apparent between the theme that contained the name Signorelli and the repressed one which immediately preceded it. Perhaps it is not superfluous to remark that the given explanation does not contradict the conditions of memory reproduction and forgetting assumed by other psychologists, which they seek in certain relations and dispositions. Only in certain cases have we added another motive to the factors long recognized as causative in forgetting names, and have thus laid bare the mechanism of faulty memory. The assumed dispositions are indispensable also in our case, in order to make it possible for the repressed element to associatively gain control over the desired name and take it along into the repression. Perhaps this would not have occurred in another name having more favorable conditions of reproduction, for it is quite probable that a suppressed element continually strives to assert itself in some other way, but attains this success only where it meets with suitable conditions. At other times the suppression succeeds without disturbance of function, or, as we may justly say, without symptoms. When we recapitulate the conditions for forgetting a name with faulty recollection, we find 1. A certain disposition to forget the same, 2. A process of suppression which has taken place shortly before, and 3. The possibility of establishing an outer association between the concerned name and the element previously suppressed. The last condition will probably not have to be much overrated, for the slightest claim on the association is apt in most cases to bring it about, but it is a different and farther-reaching question whether such outer association can really furnish the proper condition to enable the suppressed element to disturb the reproduction of the desired name, or whether, after all, a more intimate connection between the two themes is not necessarily required. On superficial consideration, one may be willing to reject the latter requirement and consider the temporal meeting in perfectly dissimilar contents as sufficient. But on more thorough examination, one finds more and more frequently that the two elements, the repressed and the new one, connected by an outer association, possess besides a connection in content, and this can also be demonstrated in the example Signorelli. The value of the understanding gained through analysis of the example Signorelli naturally depends on whether we must explain this case as a typical or as an isolated process. I must now maintain that the forgetting of a name associated with faulty recollection uncommonly often follows the same process as was demonstrated in the case of Signorelli. Almost every time that I observed this phenomenon in myself, I was able to explain it in the manner indicated above as being motivated by repression. I must mention still another viewpoint in favor of the typical nature of our analysis. I believe that one is not justified in separating the cases of name forgetting with faulty recollection from those in which incorrect substitutive names have not obtruded themselves. These substitutive names occur spontaneously in a number of cases, and in other cases, where they do not come spontaneously, they can be brought to the surface by concentration of attention, and they then show the same relation to the repressed element and the lost name as those that come spontaneously. Two factors seem to play a part in bringing to consciousness the substitutive names. First, the effort of attention, and second, an inner determinant which adheres to the psychic material. I could find the latter in the greater or lesser facility which forms the required outer associations between the two elements. A great many of the cases of name forgetting without faulty recollection therefore belong to the cases with substitutive name formation, the mechanism of which corresponds to the one in the example Signorelli. But I surely shall not venture to assert that all cases of name forgetting belong to the same group. There is no doubt that there are cases of name forgetting that proceed in a much simpler way, We shall represent this state of affairs carefully enough if we assert that besides the simple forgetting of proper names, there is another forgetting which is motivated by repression. Chapter 2, Forgetting of Foreign Words. The ordinary vocabulary of our own language seems to be protected against forgetting within the limits of normal function, but it is quite different with words from a foreign language. The tendency to forget such words extends to all parts of speech. In fact, depending on our own general state and the degree of fatigue, the first manifestation of functional disturbance evinces itself in the irregularity of our control over foreign vocabulary. In a series of cases, this forgetting follows the same mechanism as the one revealed in the example Signorelli. A demonstration of this I shall report a single analysis, characterized, however, by valuable features, concerning the forgetting of a word, not a noun, from a Latin quotation. Before proceeding, allow me to give a full and clear account of this little episode. Last summer, while journeying on my vacation, I renewed the acquaintance of a young man of academic education who, as I soon noticed, was conversant with some of my works. In our conversation we drifted, I no longer remember how, to the social position of the race to which we both belong. He, being ambitious, bemoaned the fact that his generation, as he expressed it, was destined to grow crippled, that it was prevented from developing its talents and from gratifying its desires. He concluded his passionately felt speech with the familiar verse from Virgil, Exorior, in which the unhappy Dido leaves her vengeance upon Aeneas to posterity, instead of concluded. I should have said wished to conclude, for he could not bring the quotation to an end, and attempted to conceal the open gap in his memory by transposing the words. Exorior e ex nostris ossibus alter. He finally became piqued and said, "Please don't make such mocking face, as if you were gloating over my embarrassment, but help me, there is something missing in this verse. How does it read in its complete form?" "With pleasure," I answered, and cited it correctly. Exorior e aliquis nostris ex ossibus alter. "It is too stupid to forget such word," he said. "By the way, I understand you claim that forgetting is not without its reasons. I should be very curious to find out how I came to forget this indefinite pronoun aliquis." I gladly accepted the challenge, as I hoped to get an addition to my collection, and said, "We can easily do this, but I must ask you to tell me frankly and without any criticism everything that occurs to your mind after you focus your attention, without any particular intention, on the forgotten word." "Very well, the ridiculous idea comes to me to divide the word in the following way, and liquis." "Very well, the ridiculous idea comes to me to divide the word in the following way, and liquis." "What does that mean?" "I don't know." "What else does that recall to you?" The thought goes on to leaks. "Liquidation." "Liquidity." "Fluid." "Does that mean anything to you now?" "Oh, no, not by a long shot." "Just go ahead." "I now think," he said, laughing sarcastically, "of Simon of Trent, whose relics I saw 2 years ago in church in Trent. I think of the old accusation which has been brought against the Jews again, and of the work of Kleinpaul, who sees in these supposed sacrifices reincarnations or revivals, so to speak, of the Savior. This stream of thoughts has some connection with the theme which we discussed before. The Latin word escaped you. You are right. I now think of an article in an Italian journal which I have recently read. I believe it was entitled, "What St. Augustine Said Concerning Women." What can you do with this? I waited. Now I think of something which surely has no connection with the theme. "Well, please abstain from all criticism." "Well, I know. I recall a handsome old gentleman whom I met on my journey last week. He was really an original type. He looked like our big bird of prey. His name, if you care to know, is Benedict." "Well, at least you give grouping of saints and church fathers. Saint Simon, Saint Augustine, and Saint Benedict. I believe that there was a church father named Diogenes. 3 of these, moreover, are Christian names, like Paul in the name Kleinpaul. Now I think of Saint Januarius and his blood miracle. I find that the thoughts are running mechanically. Just stop a moment, of both Saint Januarius and Saint Augustine have something to do with the calendar. Will you recall to me the blood miracle? Don't you know about it? The blood of Saint Januarius is preserved in phial in our church in Naples, and on certain holiday miracle takes place causing it to liquefy. The people think a great deal of this miracle, and become very excited if the liquefying process is retarded, as happened once during the French occupation. The general in command, Garibaldi, if I am not mistaken, then took the priest aside, and with very significant gesture pointed out to him the soldiers arrayed without, and expressed his hope that the miracle would soon take place. And it actually took place. Well, what else comes to your mind? Why do you hesitate? Something really occurred to me. but it is too intimate matter to impart. Besides, I see no connection and no necessity for telling it. I will take care of the connection. Of course I cannot compel you to reveal what is disagreeable to you, but then you should not have demanded that I tell you why you forgot the word aliquis. Really? Do you think so? Well, I suddenly thought of a woman from whom I could easily get a message that would be very annoying to us both, that she missed her courses. How could you guess such a thing? That was not very difficult. You prepared me for it long enough. Just think of the saints of the calendar, the liquefying of the blood on certain day, the excitement if the event does not take place, and the distinct threat that the miracle must take place. Indeed, you have elaborated the miracle of Saint Januarius into a clever allusion to the courses of the woman. That was surely without my knowledge. And do you really believe that my inability to reproduce the word aliquis was due to this anxious expectation? That appears to me absolutely certain. Don't you recall dividing it into liquis and the associations, reliques, liquidation, fluid? Shall I also add to this connection the fact that Saint Simon, to whom you got by way of the reliques, was Sacrifice's child? Please stop. I hope you do not take these thoughts, if I really entertain them, seriously. I will, however, confess to you that the lady is Italian and that I visited Naples in her company. May not all this be coincidental? I must leave to your own judgment whether you can explain all these connections through the assumption of coincidence. I will tell you, however, that every similar case that you analyze will lead you to just such remarkable coincidences. I have more than one reason for valuing this little analysis, for which I am indebted to my traveling companion. First, because in this case I was able to make use of a source which is otherwise inaccessible to me. Most of the examples of psychic disturbances of daily life that I have here compiled I was obliged to take from observation of myself. I endeavored to evade the far richer material furnished me by my neurotic patients, because I had to preclude the objection that the phenomena in question were only the result and manifestation of the neurosis. It was therefore of special value for my purpose to have a stranger free from all neurosis offer himself as a subject for such examination. This analysis is also important in other respects, inasmuch as it elucidates a case of word forgetting, without substitutive recollection, and thus confirms the principle formulated above, namely, that the appearance or non-appearance of incorrect substitutive recollections does not constitute an essential distinction. But the principal value of the example aliquis lies in another of its distinctions from the case signorelli. In the latter example, the reproduction of the name becomes disturbed through the after effects of a stream of thought which began shortly before and interrupted, but whose content had no distinct relation to the new theme which contained the name signorelli. Between the repression and the theme of the forgotten name there existed only the relation of temporal contiguity, which reached the other in order that the two should be able to form a connection through an outer association. On the other hand, in the example aliquis, one can note no trace of such an independent repressed theme which could occupy conscious thought. Immediately before and then re-echo as a disturbance. The disturbance of the reproduction proceeded here from the inner part of the theme touched upon, and was brought about by the fact that unconsciously a contradiction arose against the wish idea represented in the quotation. The origin must be construed in the following manner. The speaker deplored the fact that the present generation of his people was being deprived of its rights, and like Dido, he presaged that a new generation would take upon itself vengeance against the oppressors. He therefore expressed a wish for posterity. In this moment he was interrupted by the contradictory thought. Do you really wish so much for posterity? That is not true. Just think in what predicament you would be if you should now receive the information that you must expect posterity from the quarter you have in mind. No, you want no posterity, as much as you need it for your vengeance. Edit 26. This contradiction asserts itself, just as in the example signorelli, by forming an outer association between one of his ideation elements and an element of the repressed wish, but here it is brought about in most strained manner through what seems an artificial detour of associations. Another important agreement with the example signorelli results from the fact that the contradiction originates from repressed sources and emanates from thoughts which would cause deviation of attention. So much for the diversity and the interrelationship of both paradigms of the forgetting of names. We have learned to know a second mechanism of forgetting, namely, the disturbance of thought through an inner contradiction emanating from the repression. In the course of this discussion we shall repeatedly meet with this process, which seems to me to be the more easily understood. Chapter 3 Forgetting of Names and Order of Words Experiences like those mentioned concerning the process of forgetting a part of the order of words from a foreign language may cause one to wonder whether the forgetting of the order of words in one's own language requires an essentially different explanation. To be sure, one is not one to be surprised if after a while a formula or poem learned by heart can only be reproduced imperfectly, with variations and gaps. Still, as this forgetting does not affect equally all the things learned together, but seems to pick out therefrom definite parts, it may be worth our effort to investigate analytically some examples of such faulty reproductions. Brill reports the following example. While conversing one day with a very brilliant young woman, she had occasion to quote from Keats. The poem was entitled Ode to Apollo, and she recited the following lines. In thy western house of gold, where thou livest in thy state, bards, that once sublimely told prosaic truths that came too late. She hesitated many times during the recitation, being sure that there was something wrong with the last line. To her great surprise, on referring to the book, she found that not only was the last line misquoted, but that there were many other mistakes. The correct lines read as follows. Ode to Apollo. In thy western halls of gold, when thou sittest in thy state, bards, that erst sublimely told heroic deeds and sang of fate. The words italicized are those that have been forgotten and replaced by others during the recitation. She was astonished at her many mistakes, and attributed them to failure of memory. I could readily convince her, however, that there was no qualitative or quantitative disturbance of memory in her case, and recalled to her our conversation immediately before quoting these lines. We were discussing the overestimation of personality among lovers, and she thought it was Victor Hugo who said that love is the greatest thing in the world because it makes an angel or God out of grocery clerk. She continued, only when we are in love have we blind faith. In humanity, everything is perfect, everything is beautiful, and everything is so poetically unreal. Still, it is wonderful experience, worth going through, notwithstanding the terrible disappointments that usually follow. It puts us on level with the gods and incites us to all sorts of artistic activities. We become real poets, that we not only memorize and quote poetry, but we often become Apollos ourselves. She then quoted the lines given above. When I asked on what occasion she memorized the lines, she could not recall. As a teacher of elocution, she was wont to memorize so much and so often that it was difficult to tell just when she had memorized these lines. Judging by the conversation, I suggested, it would seem that this poem is intimately associated with the idea of overestimation of personality of one in love. Have you perhaps memorized this poem when you were in such state? She became thoughtful for a while and soon recalled the following facts. 12 years before, when she was 18 years old, she fell in love. She met the young man while participating in an amateur theatrical performance. He was at the time studying for the stage, and it was predicted that some day he would be matinee idol. He was endowed with all the attributes needed for such calling. He was well-built, fascinating, impulsive, very clever, and very fickle-minded. It was warned against him, but she paid no heed, attributing it all to the envy of her counselors. Everything went well for a few months, when she suddenly received word that her Apollo, for whom she had memorized these lines, had eloped with and married a very wealthy young woman. A few years later she heard that he was living in Western City, where he was taking care of his father-in-law's interests. The misquoted lines are now quite plain. The discussion about the overestimation of personality among lovers unconsciously recalled to her a disagreeable experience when she herself overestimated the personality of the man she loved. She thought he was God, but he turned out to be even worse than the average mortal. The episode could not come to the surface because it was determined by very disagreeable and painful thoughts, but the unconscious variations in the poem plainly showed her present mental state. The poetic expressions were not only changed, prosaic ones, but they clearly alluded to the whole episode. Another example of forgetting the order of words of a poem well known to the person I shall cite from Dr. C. Young, quoting the words of the author. A man wished to recite the familiar poem, "A pine tree stands alone," etc. In a line he felt drowsy, he became hopelessly stuck at the words with the white sheet. This forgetting of such a well-known verse seemed to me rather peculiar, and I therefore asked him to reproduce what came to his mind when he thought of the words. With the white sheet, he gave the following series of associations. The white sheet makes one think of white sheet on the corpse. Linen sheet with which one covers dead body. Now I think of an near friend. His brother died quite recently. He is supposed to have died of heart disease. He was also very corpulent. My friend is corpulent too, and I thought that he might meet the same fate. Probably he doesn't exercise enough. When I heard of this death, I suddenly became frightened. The same thing might happen to me, as my own family is predisposed to obesity. My grandfather died of heart disease. I also am somewhat too corpulent, and for that reason I began an obesity cure a few days ago. Young remarks. The man had unconsciously immediately identified himself with the pine tree which was covered with white sheet. For the following example of forgetting the order of words, I am indebted to my friend Dr. Ferenczi of Budapest. Unlike the former examples, it does not refer to verse taken from poetry, but to self-coined saying. It may also demonstrate to us the rather unusual case where the forgetting places itself at the disposal of discretion when the latter is in danger of yielding to momentary desire. The mistake thus advances to useful function. After we have sobered down, we justify that inner striving which at first could manifest itself only by way of inability, as in forgetting or psychic impotence. At a social gathering someone quoted "Tau comprenderse tau partner," to which I remarked that the first part of the sentence should suffice, as a pardoning is an exemption which must be left to God and the priest. One of the guests thought this observation very good, which in turn emboldened me to remark, probably to ensure myself of the good opinion of the well-disposed critic, that some time ago I thought of something still better, but when I was about to repeat this clever idea I was unable to recall. Thereupon I immediately withdrew from the company and wrote my concealing thoughts. I first recalled the name of the friend who had witnessed the birth of this desired thought and of the street in Budapest where it took place, and then the name of another friend whose name was Max, whom we usually called Maxi. That led me to the word of maxim and to the thought that at that time, as in the present case, it was a question of varying well-known maxim. Strangely enough, I did not recall any maxim but the following sentence. God created man in his own image, and its changed conception. Man created God in his own image. Immediately I recalled the sought for recollection. My friend said to me at that time in Andersey Street, "Nothing human is foreign to me," to which I remarked, basing it on psychoanalytic experience, you should go further and acknowledge that nothing animal is foreign to you. But after I had finally found the desired recollection, I was even then prevented from telling it in this social gathering. The young wife of the friend whom I had reminded of the animality of the unconscious was also among those present, and I was perforce reminded that she was not at all prepared for the reception of such unsympathetic views. The forgetting spared me a number of unpleasant questions from her and a hopeless discussion, and just that must have been the motive of the temporary amnesia. It is interesting to note that as a concealing thought there emerged sentence in which the deity is degraded to human invention, while in the sought for sentence it was an allusion to the animal and the man. The capitis diminutio is therefore common to both. The whole matter was apparently only continuation of the stream of thought concerning understanding and forgiving which was stimulated by the discussion. That the desired thought so rapidly appeared may be also due to the fact that I withdrew into a vacant room, away from the society in which it was censored. I have since then analyzed a large number of cases of forgetting or faulty reproduction of the order of words, and the consistent result of these investigations led me to assume that the mechanisms of forgetting, as demonstrated in the examples, aliquis and voto paulo, are almost of universal validity. It is not always very convenient to report such analyses, for, just as those cited, they usually lead to intimate and painful things in the person analyzed. I shall therefore add no more to the number of such examples. What is common to all these cases, regardless of the material, is the fact that the forgotten or distorted material becomes connected through some associative road with an unconscious stream of thought, which gives rise to the influence that comes to light as forgetting. I am now returning to the forgetting of names, concerning which we have so far considered exhaustively neither the casuistic elements nor the motives. As this form of faulty acts can at times be abundantly observed in myself, I am not at loss for examples. The slight attacks of migraine, from which I am still suffering, are wont to announce themselves hours before through the forgetting of names, and at the height of the attack, during which I am not forced, however, to get up my work, I am often unable to recall all proper names. Still, just such cases as mine may furnish the cause for a strong objection to our analytic efforts. Should not one be forced to conclude from such observations that the causation of the forgetfulness, especially the forgetting of names, is to be sought in circulatory or functional disturbances of the brain, and spare himself the trouble of searching for psychologic explanations for these phenomena? Not at all. That would mean to interchange the mechanism of our process, which is the same in all cases, with its variations. But instead of an analysis I shall cite a comparison which will settle the argument. Let us assume that I was so reckless as to take a walk at night in an uninhabited neighborhood of a big city, and was attacked. I robbed of my watch and purse. At the nearest police station I report the matter in the following words. I was in this or that street, and was there robbed of my watch and purse by lonesomeness and darkness. Although these words would not express anything that is incorrect, I would, nevertheless, run the danger of being considered, judging from the wording of this report, as not quite right in the head. To be correct, the state of affairs could only be described by saying that, favored by the lonesomeness of the place and under cover of darkness, I was robbed of my valuables unknown malefactors. Now, then, the state of affairs in forgetting names need not be different. Favored by exhaustion, circulatory disturbances, and intoxication, I am robbed by an unknown psychic force of the disposal over the proper names belonging to my memory. It is the same force which in other cases may bring about the same failure of memory during perfect health and mental capacity. Now, then, the state of affairs in forgetting names need not be different. Favored by exhaustion, circulatory disturbances, and intoxication, I am robbed by an unknown psychic force of the disposal over the proper names belonging to my memory. It is the same force which in other cases may bring about the same failure of memory during perfect health and mental capacity. When I analyze those cases of name forgetting occurring in myself, I find almost regularly that the name withheld shows some relation to a theme which concerns my own person and is apt to provoke in me strong and often painful emotions. Following the convenient and commendable practice of the Zurich school, Bleuler, Jung, Ricklin, I might express the same thing in the following form. The name withheld has touched a personal complex in me. The relation of the name to my person is an unexpected one and is mostly brought about through superficial associations, words of double meaning and of similar sounds. It may generally be designated as a-side association. A few simple examples will best illustrate the nature of the same. A patient requested me to recommend to him a sanatorium in the Riviera. I knew of such a place very near Genoa. I also recalled the name of the German colleague who was in charge of the place, but the place itself I could not name, well as I believed I knew it. There was nothing left to do but ask the patient to wait, and to appeal quickly to the women of the family. Just what is the name of the place near Genoa where Dr. X, as his small institution in which his so-and-so remained so long under treatment? Of course you would forget name of that Tsar. The name is nervy. To be sure, I have enough to do with nerves. B. Another patient spoke about a neighboring summer resort, and maintained that besides the two familiar inns it was author, I disputed the existence of any third inn, and referred to the fact that I had spent 7 summers in the vicinity, and therefore knew more about the place than he. Instigated by my contradiction, he recalled the name. The name of the third inn was the Hotwardner. Of course, I had to admit it. Indeed, I was forced to confess that for 7 summers I had lived near this very inn whose existence I had so strenuously denied. But why should I have forgotten the name and the object? I believe because the name sounded very much like that of a Vienna colleague who practiced the same specialty as my own. It touched in me the professional complex. See, on another occasion, when about to buy railroad ticket on the right in All station, I could not recall the very familiar name of the next big railroad station which I had so often passed. I was forced to look it up in the timetable. The name was Rosenheim. I soon discovered through what associations I lost it. An hour earlier I had visited my sister in her home near Ryan-Hall. My sister's name is Rose, hence also Roseholm. This name was taken away by my family complex. D. This predatory influence of the family complex I can demonstrate in a whole series of complexes. One day I was consulted by a young man, a younger brother of one of my female patients, whom I saw any number of times, and whom I used to call by his first name. Later, while wishing to talk about his visit, I forgot his first name, in no way an unusual one, and could not recall it in any way. I walked into the street to read the business signs, and recognized the name as soon as it met my eyes. The analysis showed that I had formed a parallel between the visitor and my own brother which sent it in the question. Would my brother, in a similar case, have behaved like him, or even more contrarily? The outer connection between the thoughts concerning the stranger and my own family was rendered possible through the accident that the name of the mothers in each case was the same, Amelia. Subsequently, I also understood the substitutive names, Daniel and Frank, which obtruded themselves without any explanation. These names, as well as Amelia, belong to Schiller's play The Robbers. They are all connected with Joke of the Vienna pedestrian, Daniel Spitzer. On another occasion I was unable to find patient's name which had certain reference to my early life. The analysis had to be followed over long devious road before the desired name was discovered. The patient expressed his apprehension lest he should lose his eyesight. This recalled a young man who became blind from gunshot, and this again led to picture of another youth who shot himself, and the latter bore the same name as my first patient, though not at all related to him. The name became known to me, however, only after the anxious apprehension from these 2 juvenile cases was transferred to person in my own family. Thus an incessant stream of self-reference flows through my thoughts concerning which I usually have no inkling, but which betrays itself through such name-forgetting. It seems as if I were forced to compare with my own person all that I hear about strangers, as if my personal complexes became stirred up at every information from others, It seems impossible that this should be an individual peculiarity of my own person. It must, on the contrary, point to the way we grasp outside matters in general. I have reasons to assume that other individuals meet with experiences quite similar to mine. The best example of this kind was reported to me by a gentleman named Lederer as personal experience. While on his wedding trip in Venice, he came across a man with whom he was but slightly acquainted and whom he was obliged to introduce to his wife. As he forgot the name of the stranger, he got himself out of the embarrassment the first time by mumbling the name, unintelligibly. Though when he met the man a second time, as is inevitable in Venice, he took him aside and begged him to help him out of the difficulty by telling him his name, which he unfortunately had forgotten. The answer of the stranger pointed to superior knowledge of human nature. I readily believe that you did not grasp my name. My name is like yours. Letter, one cannot suppress slight feeling of unpleasantness on discovering his own name in a stranger. I had recently felt it very plainly when I was consulted during my office hours by a man named S. Freud. However, I am assured by one of my own critics that in this respect he behaves in quite the opposite manner. F. The effect of personal relation can be recognized also in the following examples reported by you. Mr. Y. falls in love with a lady who soon thereafter marries Mr. X. In spite of the fact that Mr. Y. was an old acquaintance of Mr. X. and had business relations with him, he repeatedly forgot the name, and on a number of occasions, when wishing to correspond with X, he was obliged to ask other people for his name. However, the motivation for the forgetting is more evident in this case than in the preceding ones, which were under the constellation of personal reference. Here the forgetting is manifestly a direct result of the dislike of Y. For the happy rival, he does not wish to know anything about him. G. The following case, reported by Ferenczi, the analysis of which is especially instructive through the explanation of the substitutive thoughts, like Botticelli, Boltraffio de Signorelli, shows in somewhat different way how self-reference leads to the forgetting of name. A lady who heard something about psychoanalysis could not recall the name of the psychiatrist Jung. Instead, the following names occurred to her. Kale, name, Wilde, Nietzsche, Hauptmann. I did not tell her the name and requested her to repeat her free associations to every thought. To Kale. She had once thought of Mrs. Kale, that she was an embellished and affected person who looked very well for her age. She does not age. As general and principal conception of Wilde and Nietzsche, she gave the association a mental disease. She then added jocosely, the Freudians will continue looking for the causes of mental diseases until they themselves become insane. She continued, I cannot bear Wilde and Nietzsche. I do not understand them. I hear that they were both homosexual. Wilde has occupied himself with young people. Although she uttered in the sentence the correct name, she still could not remember it. To Hauptmann she associated the words half and youth, and only after I called her attention to the word youth did she become aware that she was looking for the name Young. It is clear that this lady, who had lost her husband at the age of 39 and had no prospect of marrying a second time, had cause enough to avoid reminiscences recalling youth or old age. The remarkable thing is that the concealing thoughts of the desired name came to the surface as simple association, of content without any sound associations, each still different and very finely motivated as an example of name forgetting which the person concerned has himself explained. While taking an examination in philosophy as minor subject, I was questioned by the examiner about the teachings of Epicurus, and was asked whether I knew who took up his teachings centuries later. I answered that it was Pierre Gassendi, whom 2 days before while in cafe I had happened to hear spoken of as follower of Epicurus. To the question how I knew this, I boldly replied that I had taken an interest in Gassendi for a long time. This resulted in a certificate with magna cum laude, but later, unfortunately, also in persistent tendency to forget the name Gassendi. I believe that it is due to my guilty conscience that even now I cannot retain this name despite all efforts. I had no business knowing it at that time. To have proper appreciation of the intense repugnance entertained by our narrator against the recollection of this examination episode, one must have realized how highly he prizes his doctor's degree, and for how many other things this substitute must stand. I add here another example of forgetting the name of a city, an instance which is perhaps not as simple as those given before, but which will appear credible and valuable to those more familiar with such investigations. The name of an Italian city withdrew itself from memory on account of its far-reaching sound similarity to a woman's first name, which was in turn connected with various emotional reminiscences which were surely not exhaustively treated in this report. Dr. S. Ferenczi, who observed this case of forgetting in himself, treated it, quite justly, as an analysis of a dream or an erotic idea. Today I visited some old friends, and the conversation turned to cities of northern Italy. Someone remarked that they still showed the Austrian influence. Few of these cities were cited. I too wished to mention one, but the name did not come to me, although I knew that I had spent 2 very pleasant days there. This, of course, does not quite concur with Freud's theory of forgetting. Instead of the desired name of the city, there obtruded themselves the following thoughts: Capua, Brescia, the Lion of Brescia. This lion I saw objectively before me in the form of a marble statue, but I soon noticed that he resembled less the lion of the statue, Liberty in Brescia, which I saw only in picture, than the other marble lion which I saw in Lucerne on the monument in honor of the Swiss guard fallen in the Tuileries. I finally thought of the desired name. It was Verona. I knew at once the cause of this amnesia. No other than a former servant of the family whom I visited at the time. Her name was Veronica, in Hungarian Verona. I felt great antipathy for her on account of her repulsive physiognomy, as well as her hoarse, shrill voice and her unbearable self-assertion, to which she thought herself entitled on account of her long service. Also the tyrannical way in which she treated the children of the family was insufferable to me. Now I knew the significance of the substitutive thoughts. To Capua I immediately associated caput mortuum. I had often compared Veronica's head to skull. The Hungarian word capsule, greed after money, surely furnished determinant for the displacement. Naturally, I also found those more direct associations which connected Capua and Verona as geographical ideas and as Italian words of the same rhythm. The same held true for Brescia here, too. I found concealed side tracks of associations of ideas. My antipathy at that time was so violent that I thought Veronica very ugly, and have often expressed my astonishment at the fact that any one should love her. Why, to kiss her, I said, must provoke nausea. Brescia, at least in Hungary, is very often mentioned not in connection with the lion but with another wild beast. The most hated name in this country, as well as in North Italy, is that of General Haino, who is briefly referred to as the hyena of Brescia. From the hated tyrant Haino one stream of thought leads over Brescia, the city of Verona, and the other over the idea of the grave-digging animal with a hoarse voice, which corresponds to the thought of a monument to the dead, to the skull, and to the disagreeable organ of Veronica, which was so cruelly insulted in my unconscious mind. Veronica in her time ruled as tyrannically as did the Austrian general after the Hungarian and Italian struggles for liberty. Lucerne is associated with the idea of the summer which Veronica spent with her employers in place near Lucerne. The Swiss guard again recalls that she tyrannized not only the children but also the adult members of the family, and thus played the part of the guard dame. I expressly observe that this antipathy of mine against V consciously belongs to things long overcome. Since that time she has changed in her appearance and manner very much to her advantage, so that I am able to meet her with sincere regard. To be sure, I hardly find such occasion. As usual, however, my unconscious sticks more tenaciously to those impressions. It is old in its resentment. The Tuileries represent an allusion to second personality. An old French lady who actually guarded the women of the house, and who was in high regard and somewhat feared by everybody. For a long time I was her élève in French conversation. The word élève recalls that when I visited the brother-in-law of my present host in northern Bohemia, I had to laugh a great deal because the rural population referred to the élèves, pupils, of the School of Forestry as Lowen lions. Also this jocose recollection might have taken part in the displacement of the hyena by the lion. The following example can also show how personal complex swaying the person at the time being made by devious ways bring about the forgetting of name. 2 men, an elder and a younger, who had traveled together in Sicily 6 months before, exchanged reminiscences of those pleasant and interesting days. Let's see, what was the name of that place? Asked the younger, where we passed the night before taking the trip to Selenon. Caldafini, was it not? The elder rejected this by saying, certainly not, but I have forgotten the name, too, although I can recall perfectly all the details of the place. Whenever I hear someone forget a name, it immediately produces forgetfulness in me. Let us look for the name. I cannot think of any other name except Calton, I said, which is surely not correct. No, said the younger, the name begins with, or contains, W. But the Italian language contains no W, retorted the elder. I really meant V, and I said W, because I am accustomed to interchange them in my mother tongue. The elder, however, objected to the V. He added, I believe that I have already forgotten many of the Sicilian names. Suppose we try to find out. For example, what is the name of the place situated on a height which was called in antiquity? Oh, I know that. Castro Giovanni. In the next moment the younger man discovered the lost name. He cried out Castelvetrano, and was pleased to be able to demonstrate the supposed V. For a moment the elder still lacked the feeling of recognition, but after he accepted the name he was able to state why it had escaped him. He thought, obviously because the second half, veterano, suggests veteran. I am aware that I am not quite anxious to think of aging, and react peculiarly when I am reminded of it. Thus e.g. I had recently reminded very esteemed friend in most unmistakable terms that he had long ago passed the years of youth, because before this he once remarked in the most flattering manner, and he am no longer a young man, that my resistance was directed against the second half of the name Castelvetrano is shown by the fact that the initial sound of the same returned in the substitutive name Caltaniceta. What about the name Caltaniceta itself? Asked the younger. That always seemed to me like pet name of young woman, admitted the elder. Somewhat later he added, the name Ferno is also only substitutive name, and now it occurs to me that the name Castro Giovanni, which obtruded itself with the aid of rationalization, alludes as expressly to Giovanni, young, as the last name, Castelvetrano, to veteran. The older man believed that he had thus accounted for his forgetting the name. What the motive was that led the young man to this memory failure was not investigated. In some cases, one must have recourse to all the fineness of psychoanalytic technique in order to explain the forgetting of name. Those who wish to read an example of such work I refer to Communication by Professor E. Jones. I could multiply the examples of name forgetting and prolong the discussion very much further if I did not wish to avoid elucidating here almost all the viewpoints which will be considered in later themes. I shall, however, take the liberty of comprehending in a few sentences the results of the analyses reported here. The mechanism of forgetting, or rather of losing or temporary forgetting of, a name consists in the disturbance of the intended reproduction of the name through a strange stream of thought unconscious at the time. Between the disturbed name and the disturbing complex there exists a connection either from the beginning or such. A connection has been formed, perhaps by artificial means, through superficial, outer associations. The self-reference complex, personal, family, or professional, proves to be the most effective of the disturbing complexes, name which by virtue of its many meanings belongs to a number of thought associations. Complexes is frequently disturbed in its connection to one series of thoughts through stronger complex belonging to the other associations. To avoid the awakening of pain through memory is one of the objects among the motives of these disturbances. In general, one may distinguish two principal cases of name forgetting, when the name itself touches something unpleasant, or when it is brought into connection with other associations which are influenced by such effects, so that names can be disturbed on their own account or on account of their near or more remote associative relations in the reproduction. A review. These general principles readily convinces us that the temporary forgetting of a name is observed as the most frequent faulty action of our mental functions. However, we are far from having described all the peculiarities of this phenomenon. I also wish to call attention to the fact that name forgetting is extremely contagious. In a conversation between two persons, the mere mention of having forgotten this or that name by one often suffices to induce the same memory slip in the other. But wherever the forgetting is induced, the sought for name easily comes to the surface. There is a continuous forgetting of names in which whole chains of names are withdrawn from memory. If in the course of endeavoring to discover an escaped name one finds others with which the latter is intimately connected, it often happens that these new names also escape. The forgetting thus jumps from one name to another as if to demonstrate the existence of a hindrance not to be easily removed. This has been part 1 of Psych for Psychology's reading of the Psychopathology of Everyday Life by Sigmund Freud, 1901. Thanks for listening.